Welcome to tonight's Zoom meeting. I don't think this is hosted by Vineyard Politico now that I've been elected or going to be put in or sworn in. My name is Jake Holdaway. I'm a recently elected city council member for Vineyard City. And in my experience in dealing with anything, you want to bring the voices from around the county, from around the state, and across the nation and bring in some of the brightest minds, especially when you're faced from a nonpartisan standpoint of a Vineyard City. You want to bring in, Democrats, Republicans, libertarians to kind of really understand, especially with the quick turnaround and the posting of the Vineyard Inland Port. So today what we're going to do is I've asked Dita Seed to start off. She's going to give about 20 minutes kind of background of what her experience is. I'll introduce her in just a second. And then we're going to have kind of a Republican kind of standpoint of, okay, this is our experience and this is what we know from a Republican standpoint. And then also Enoch has studied out ports, kind of gone through that. And then we're going to have a question and answer at the end. So if you want to, Sean Herring is going to be handling our Q&A and the questions. So if you want to submit them to the whole body at the end or just individually, we can go through and do that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Dita, to talk before she goes through, I'm just going to introduce her. Dita Seed is a former Salt Lake City council member and city administrator. I've actually known and read Dita for quite some time, over 2 years, engaged with her at Utah Lake, through the Lake Authority, and also through Wakara Way. She's joined a coalition called Stop Polluting Port Coalition. It's to help prevent the various different harms of inland ports developments. And also, some of this harm includes local government losing control of the development, how taxation and revenue, it works with an inland port in areas, and also just traffic congestion, air, water, and noise. So Dita, if you want to turn over, and then we'll go to Christy from that point.
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me, Jacob. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you a map that shows the first inland port jurisdictional area. So you're all seeing my screen now, and this fluorescent green area is, this is within Salt Lake City. There's a tiny portion of West Valley here and a tiny portion of Magna. It's like over here, I think. Oh no, it's probably over here. At any rate, this is the first inland port area that was created. It was created in 2018, and the second to last day of the legislative session, then Speaker Greg Hughes, along with his chief of staff, Greg Hartley, and Greg Hartley's brother, Jeff Hartley, who some of you may know from the Utah Lake Island debacle. They were the proponents of this. And this area that my cursor is going over represents about 22% of the total area of Salt Lake City. And I'm going to stop sharing now. What happened was the legislature decided that they wanted to take control of this 16,000 acres away from Salt Lake City, away from the local government, to create an inland port. And they were really, and this is true still to this day, really unable to define what an inland port is. So for practical purposes, what it is an area that, they draw a line around, and then everything in that area is eligible for pretty significant tax breaks moving into the future, and the property owners in the area also potentially could avail themselves of very low interest loans from the issuance of bonds. And just I think the very basic thing that people need to know is that when the Utah Inland Port Authority, which is now, its composition has changed, the oversight of Port Authority has changed over time. It originally had like a 12-member board that had some local representation on it from Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County. And then they reconfigured it because what's happened, the short version of the story, is that over the last 6 years, since 2018, they've done absolutely nothing except spend public money to pay consultants and themselves. And they're actually in the situation right now where they made such a bad business deal. They're on the hook for a lease that is $120,000 a month in public money for absolutely nothing. That money is just going into the pocket of the developer that owns that property. And so they have this history of failure. In its current iteration, the Utah Inland Port Authority Board is controlled by 5 people. So there are 3 people appointed by the legislature. So what you need to know is that the legislature has the majority of the votes on the Inland Port Authority Board. And so they're the major decision makers. And then the governor has 2 appointments. And there are no longer any local people from anywhere who have voting authority on the Inland Port Authority Board. There is a Salt Lake City council member who is a non-voting member of the board, and she can make suggestions, but she has absolutely no decision-making authority. So they've taken all the local control away from Salt Lake City. And some of you may know the story. The city sued and did not prevail in the courts. But what happened as a result of all the chaos was that the Port Authority and the city entered into a contract whereby some of that money that the Port Authority is taking is now supposed to go back to the city. Except that's what's happening with this now is that in spite of this contract, in spite of promises made, the Port Authority is not following through with the things that it said it would do, and is telling the city that it doesn't like the Salt Lake City's ideas for how to move forward with the requirements. And the requirements of the contract were that the Port Authority would do a study, a human health risk assessment, a community impact assessment, and a traffic study to show how all of this new warehouse development, because really think of the Inland Port Authority as an entity that causes industrial development to happen on a much faster time frame. And they even say this. They said this to the poor folks in Tooele recently, where some project areas are being were just adopted. They said, think of it as fast tracking growth in your community. Well, what local community wants that to happen? And the reason it's fast tracked is because it's subsidized with our tax dollars. So anyway, the Salt Lake City version of the story has been really disappointing in terms of them making promises and breaking them. And so I'm saying this to you, all of you in Utah County, that you cannot, I'm sorry to say this, but you can't trust them to look out for your interests. What happens is once they get involved, then it's really, the discussions about what happens on the property are discussions between the developer and the Port Authority, and local government isn't in the picture. Even though local government technically has some authority still, that doesn't play out in reality. And so what you could have in Vineyard is a situation where it's the developer of the property and the Port Authority, and you as local elected officials and community members are just, out of luck in terms of being able to influence what kind of development occurs with public money in your community. So this is, if for people who care about local control and government accountability and responsible use of our tax dollars, this is a catastrophic situation. I just will show you one more slide, because what's happening right now is the Port Authority is in this frenzy of creating these project areas. And what's really concerning about that is that they do not have the staff to watch over these either. All of these project areas, there are about 8 of them now. And that makes the likelihood of things going awry all even greater. And it makes the likelihood of private interests, developers getting away with things even greater, because there's nobody, watching over how this all unfolds. So I'm going to go ahead.
The Planning Commission of Salt Lake City was removed, so they no longer have any type of authority when you're.
Oh, they have long ago. And so Salt Lake City, here's the other thing. Well, they'll say that Salt Lake City zoning laws still apply, but what the Port Authority did through statute is to freeze Salt Lake City zoning at 2018. So there can be no more changes to anything. Like, they've cut the city out from making any forward-looking changes in the zoning. So they can say, well, city still has zoning authority, but that's meaningless because the city's hands are tied by the statute that created the Utah Inland Port Authority. So I will say, like, the one thing that I think could be very powerful potential. Well, let me back up and tell you about the audit. So right now, the leadership of the Port Authority, and this is going to change soon, consists of Representative Mike Schultz, who you all know was just made the Speaker of the House. He's going to go off the Port Authority board and will likely be replaced by Representative Jefferson Moss, who is the House Majority Leader from Saratoga Springs. So maybe that is somebody that you could talk to about this. And then on the Senate side, we have Senator Jerry Stevenson. So Senator Stevenson was very involved in the original bill, and he got rolled by Greg Hughes. He'll even say that. Like, he was negotiating with the city, trying to make it something that was, more respected local control. And, on the second to last day of the session at 9:30 at night, Hughes rolls out this bill that Stevenson hadn't even seen. And so Senator Stevenson now, as a board member, he wasn't on the board originally, is trying to make things right. I think that's his goal. And so what he did when he came on the board, and this was after a series of catastrophic mistakes by the previous administration of the Port Authority, where they bonded for $150 million and then found out that the project that they were going to use that money for was not viable from a business perspective. And that's where they ended up in this lease agreement with a developer, where now for 40 years, they're paying them $120,000 a month for absolutely nothing. It's outrageous. I mean, that's millions and millions of taxpayer dollars.
That's going on right now.
Oh yeah, right now. There's newspaper articles about it. So Stevenson came in, Senator Stevenson, and he said, okay, we need an audit. And so what he asked, because what he wanted to do was to say, okay, we're turning the page here. This, mistakes happen, things are bad. Actually, the new director of the Port Authority, who was on the board before he became the director, said, this was an exact quote, sketchy crap happened. He used that word, that term, sketchy crap, to the legislature. Well, so Stevenson did the audit, or had the audit done, right? Because he's in leadership, he could ask for that. But it wasn't a full audit. And the auditors said, we want to do a full audit. We need a full audit. And Senator Stevenson was like, no, this is good. We know things are bad. We're turning the page. It's all going to be fine. So that was last fall. And now here we are a year later, and things are not fine. Things are more chaotic than ever. And I think that collectively, if we have leaders from different communities with work projects asking for a full audit, we could maybe get legislative leaders to do that. And that would be a really good thing. And we could talk about these issues of where the money is going and how.
So right now for Vineyard City, if we were to say, can we get a full audit just to see if this is sustainable, to see if you've been successful or anything like that, we couldn't even get it because they don't even want to provide it, a full audit?
Well, we should ask. We don't know the answer to that question. And I'm noting in the chat, there are two kinds of audits. So there's the audit that comes from the Legislative Auditor General's office. they're great auditors. They're very honest people, and they get asked by the legislature to investigate things. And so the audit, you all should read it. We'll send it to you. The audit that they did for the Port Authority that came out last fall was scathing. I mean, there is nothing defensible in there. All sorts of like ignoring bidding processes, like sole source bidding, or giving their friends these contracts. It was just terrible. So they fixed some things, but there's still this problem of them creating these project areas all over the place. And last week, just after we found out about Vineyard, they created 2 project areas in Tooele. One of them is the project area property is owned by the father and uncle of a state representative. And then the other project area is owned by Josh Romney. Tooele has no water. They're wells. They're dependent on wells. And there's been no analysis of what this is going to do, all this industrial development. And there, if you've been to Tooele, like it's a little valley, what it's going to do to their water, just for starters, let alone like traffic. So I'm sorry, I'm on a rant, but the Romney group did a traffic study. The developers did a traffic study, and the result of that was 50,000 additional vehicle trips generated by their development. That's just for one project area, and their project area is smaller than Salt Lake City, and smaller actually than or maybe comparable to what you've got in Vineyard. So think about what 50,000 additional vehicles will do to your community, and 30,000 of those are probably diesel trucks. So there are all these questions that do not get answered for the communities. And one more thing, and then I'll be quiet and we can take questions. So the Grantsville City Council was asked by the developer. So this is all developer driven. That's where it's coming from, to adopt a resolution, just like what's going to happen tomorrow night in Vineyard. Adopt a resolution supporting the inland port. And so, you know, you can listen to this tape. It's heartbreaking because the 2 of the Grantsville City Council members were saying, we don't understand how this works. How does the financing work? And that's where the person from the Port Authority said, well, it's fast tracking growth. And we're cheating a little bit. And he used that word 4 times. And then he said, and then they said, well, if we approve this, if we vote for this resolution, can we at some point walk it back, rescind it? And he was like, yeah, sure, you can do that. He told them. Now, like technically, I think that's true. And so actually the Tooele people now are saying to their city council members, we'll rescind it because we don't want this. We don't understand like fully what the harm it's going to do to our community. The 2 council members asked about environmental harm, and the Port Authority said, we don't cause any harm. Well, that's just not true. So that's kind of, the dynamic that communities are facing.
Well, 2 questions before we go to Christy. One, you said that they have no projects right now, still years later, like that are going at the port
In Salt Lake City?
In Salt Lake City?
Yeah.
So how is it fast tracked if nothing's done?
Well, that's a good point. But I think things haven't been fast tracked in Salt Lake City, and it's because they didn't really figure out what they were going to do beforehand. Like nobody can really tell you what an inland port is. So that's part of the problem. Like this is I think this is all about developers grabbing money out of the public trough. And that's what's driving this. And it's not really about great projects that are going to help the community. They're sort of this is what the former board chair of the Port Authority said. This was years ago, like in 2019. He said, we're building the plane as we're flying it. And our response was, hey, you know what? Don't do that with public money, okay? Don't do that with our community. That is not smart public policy making. It's not a wise use of government resources. We need accountability.
So the second part is I've followed Jeff Hartley and Greg Hughes' connection to LRS. After the beginning of the year, we plan to do a full audit and investigation as to what's going on with our city, our mayor, and everything once we get into power. But so basically, Greg Hughes and Jeff Hartley at the end of a legislative session is able to run a bill. And because of that, they circumvent the entire city of Salt Lake on planning. And then they're able to go get these big loans or bonded, I guess.
Yeah, they issued bonds. There's
And those-
bonding authority.
And that bonding authority is through like federal bonds, I guess. I'm guessing.
No, it's
through-
through a public infrastructure district, a
Wow.
PID. And everyone should be very skeptical of these things because it's really a way to funnel government money into private hands. But they can create, and that's what they'll do, and they'll probably talk about this in Vineyard, is they're going to create a project area and then they're going to create a public infrastructure district around the project area. And then they're going to go out for bonds. They're going to, and then once that happens, there's this giant, then, publicly funded piggy bank for them to use to hand out to developers.
Wow. Okay. So let's, Christy has talked to me about a little bit of PIDs. So let's break it down for the average person, and then we'll come back to Q&A with you, Dita. So Christy, talk to us about a PID, and thank you for giving us kind of the democratic, hey, this is where we're coming from, more liberal side of things. I mean, quite honestly, you want to take advice from wherever you can get, like what has been your experience so far. So Christy, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Dita, I'm so grateful for her and all of her knowledge and background on the inland port. And I think this is something that the right and the left can get together on. So just a couple of comments about the inland port. So they have made some changes. A lot of the things that she talked about were absolutely true and horrific. They have done some really good things in making the process a little bit better. And so there's a podcast, I believe, on We Are the People that has Representative Schultz on it, as well as Ben Hart from the Inland Port, and they talk about some of the stuff that they have cleaned up. Okay, with that said, that is not advocating for the process and what happened, but I did want to let you know that there have been some good steps. What we had seen a year or so ago, like she said, with that audit was absolutely atrocious. So some of that stuff did get cleaned up. So I do want to speak to, because I know a little bit more about PIDs, and I continue to learn more every single day. And so I'm going to tell you, because they get complicated, just some of the stuff that the category that PIDs are in and what they can do. So for a while, we thought that all special districts, so you have a local district, which is usually your local municipality, and that's your city council. And then historically, you would have special districts, and that would be your water district or your sewer district. And this was things that the city council didn't have enough time to manage, but they reported back to your city council. And so you had an elected official tied to these special districts. And so what we are seeing with these government entity districts is that we are untethering special districts from our local districts. And so that is a version of the PID. There's other ones. And so there's different categories. So you'll kind of hear interchangeably special district, government entity, or a PID. And let me tell you, a PID is a public infrastructure district. And so I think I gave you some links, and the first one that was passed in 2019, and that would have been SB 228, and that was Dan McKay and Representative Dunnigan were the ones who passed that. There's also a really good article that I sent you that has to do with, it's from the Harriman Journal, when they brought a PID to them. And so public infrastructure districts can, and this is where it gets a little bit concerning, is they have taxing authority. They also have bonding authority.
When you
and
say
then
say that, I want to stop. So this new PID that is not elected by Vineyard City, this new board, similar to Salt Lake City being removed. This new, someone will be appointed to this. This new board would be given taxing authority over that specific, even though they're not a government, you couldn't vote them in or out, they would be giving
Right.
taxing authority.
Taxing authority, bonding authority, and fining authority. And so what it takes to become a PID is that you have to have 100% of the landowners agree. And so that's why it's
They put that out.
right. That's why it's often used by developers, because like in the case of the inland port, 100% would be whoever the developer is, and then the inland port. So you'd have two people agreeing. And so when you read it, it sounds like, oh, that's awesome. We have to get 100% of people to agree, but sometimes that's party of one or party of two. And so once they can do that, they can become a PID after that. And so the Harriman Journal article is really great. That has to do with building homes. So that one gets a little more difficult. But what they were doing essentially was bonding for the future. And so when somebody would purchase the home, they would get in, they would have both their property tax, and then they'd also have this bond come back on them. And sometimes they were equal. So the state legislature, just at the end of interim this year, they have a new one, let me tell you, called an infrastructure financing district. And that is to try and make it so that the bond is not due on top of the property tax, that the developer has to pay the bond off when they sell the home. And so they're trying to clean up the problem that PIDs had made. And so for me, fundamentally, the problem is, just like you said, when you have taxing authority by an unelected body, that's a problem. Because what do? You know, especially like Salt Lake was a great case, and Dita brought that up. If you run into problems with this, and this was the caution that I thought with Vineyard, and I just want to say we are doing everything we can to communicate with legislators about Vineyard and what is happening in a bunch of different fronts. And so I just want you guys to know that we are aware of Vineyard and what's going on, and our hope is to just provide information, to be able to answer questions, to be able to communicate with elected officials that they will answer questions for the city of Vineyard. And so I just wanted to let you guys know that we are working on that and trying to open the lines of communication there. So let me tell you just a couple of concerns. Dita mentioned one of them, negative externalities. And so in questions that I would ask to the city council is, were they provided with a list of pros and cons and the potential for negative externalities that could come about from, like she said, traffic or resources or the processing that comes from industrial areas? I know Vineyard already has some of those concerns, and to add something on top of that is another issue. And then also, is it self-sustainable? And so could this be sustainable within Utah and with the port? Because you guys are dealing with two issues. Is the port a good idea, and what the heck is a PID? And so you're trying to figure out, will we be taxed on top of an RDA, right? And with a PID there. And so you guys have multiple issues happening. And so the solutions that I wanted to talk about that maybe they would be willing to listen to is call for a full audit, like they said, and don't pass anything until they've seen some sort of an audit or a pro and con list, negative externalities. And then the two things that they really need to do is change the board. So similar to the Utah Lake Commission, where you have a local representative on the board that can contribute to those conversations, that is elected by the people, the port needs to have something similar to that as well. And so
person, don't you think you would hold the majority chair? I mean, how are you? I mean, I don't know about this, but in America, it just seems strange that you would say, hey, I as a business, I'm friends with Jeff Hartley and Greg Hughes, and so therefore we want to create this independent, sovereign public district, right?
Right.
And therefore I can circumvent the entire Vineyard Planning Commission, and because they represent the voice of our citizens. So in my mind, it's like, how would you remove this vote? Is basically voting to say we're removing our citizens, unless I'm getting it wrong. How are the citizens, if this vote goes through, ever heard?
That is what I think Salt Lake showed us, is that once, and this was my caution with this, is once this power is given, the path back is rough, if maybe not, non-existent. And so these are the questions that I would ask. Also, one of the things is, just last session, there's two bills, HB 22 and HB 77. They were Kurt Bramble and Barlow. And what these did is they went through all of code and they just changed one word. They changed local to special. So they took all the local districts and they reclassified them as special districts. So if anybody's been paying attention to what's been going on with Disney, and Disney is considered a special district. And so when you look up, you don't change one word in code just because you want to speak differently. You're usually looking at legal differences. And so the question when we saw that come up was, well, then what are the legal differences? So the reason that was given was that a lot of federal grants come in that language, and that they will use the language with special district, and that local districts seem to be more specific to Utah specifically, like we use the term local district. And so HB 22, HB 77, changing just local to special. And then we have all these new PIDs and TIFs and TODs. And the TIF is a transportation infrastructure, and the TOD, all of those are around track stations and things like that. But once you start making these different government entities and calling them special districts, my concern with that is they're not tethered to a local district. And so just like you used to go talk to your city council about the water district or the sewer district, where do you go when you get your tax statement? And this was some of the things that we had come up this fall, is people were getting their taxes and they understood the top part of it. And then below it, they were starting to see upwards of like 18 different special districts, and they're untethered. And so they have their own meetings and their own boards. And so some of these are still connected to the local district, but I don't know what your life is like, but I don't have enough time to go to 18 different meetings, even if they are open to the public and take public comment. And so this for me is like a broader picture with the PIDs, but also untethering and having these special districts not tethered to local districts and having taxing authority. And so I guess if I were to whittle it down and fundamentally say, if they're going to take your money, they should be elected, and they should have meetings that are connected to your local municipality. And this violates those. And so there is a really great resource. I think I sent it to you. Utah Freedom Coalition did a blog on special districts, and you can go through and look at those. There's also ties to the public-private partnership contracts. And so the port has a lot of PPPs. They're also called PPPs. But essentially they are just government contracts with corporations. And so once you get into this combination of these three things, so I would be asking the questions about pros and cons. Why do we have to do this right now? If this is a good idea for Vineyard right now, can't we take our time and have this be a good idea for Vineyard in a couple of months? I don't understand why this is so pressing right before the holiday season and where people don't have as much time. And so if you guys could have them take their time with such a serious decision that's going to affect your community that seems to be more difficult to walk back, I would definitely ask for time.
So, just to give you guys a perspective, Dita and Christy, we're talking, I tried to do it on Google. We're talking about 50% of Vineyard's tax or business district. That is included in this parcel of land. I did it roughly on Google of like, hey, this is property or whatnot. And it was like, holy cow, to de-annex and remove our decision for 50% of our tax base. In my mind, and I'm going to ask you this question in just a second, how long of a process would you take to think about that? And then blindly go, hey, Jeff Hartley, where we've already had problems with the islands and all of that. Hey, we trust this group. It's like, can we at least go through this? And so be thinking about what thing, yeah. Okay, if we were going to go through this. And Christy, we didn't present you at all. I know you're the Republican Party chair of the county, and I didn't say that at the beginning. So I wanted people to understand your position, you were recently elected in February or the last, I don't know.
April, yeah,
April
in the
this
spring.
year.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to let people understand that, you're not just someone with an opinion, it's speaking, at that role and understanding that. So good. Enoch, you've heard two sides. Where are you coming in, and is there something wrong, or is there something that you'd add?
Yeah, I heard from everyone who spoke, and what touches on what I think I see as the core problem, but from slightly different viewpoints. You made the statement, Jacob, where we're moving out the citizens, right? And Christy talked about this untethering. And Dita talked about losing authority in Salt Lake County, right? And there's also these comments of it being developer driven. So you can see that there's developers are private businesses, right? So this is driven by private individuals is an issue. And these are all, I want to point out how the Utah Constitution has actually addressed all these problems and gives power to the cities to fight against these things. And I think it's in a way that a lot of times people don't think of. So when you talk about paying consultants in themselves, Dita mentioned that, and funneling government money into private hands. So the first thing in our state constitution is Article 6, Section 28. It forbids deferring municipal powers to third parties. And that's really what we're seeing going on here. As far back as the 90s, and you can go back in history and see various attempts to do this kind of thing. This is just the latest in recent times where they're trying to get away with it again, but putting new clothes on it. Article 11, Section 7 says if you create a special district, it must be governed by the governing authority of where it is. So if there's a special district in Vineyard must remain in control the whole time. Thinking about that taxing authority where people say, you had 18 meetings to go to, Christy mentioned, right? You should only have one place to go to when you're dealing with taxes, and that's your representatives. That is also how we fulfill the requirement, Article 1, Section 2, that all political power is inherent in the people. Well, it's the city council that holds the voice of the people and the authority. It can't be some unelected offshoot that has no accountability structure to the people. Then we have Article 12, Section 20. A free market system is the state policy of the state of Utah, and contracts in restraint of trade. This is what we're seeing when we talk about developer-driven, funneling government money to private hands, and ultimately it's about creating a special class of people when these private individuals have access to government money. So I think a lot of the arguments that are made here could be made even if the city itself was doing this program. Then you talk about studies and is it good for us and pros and cons. But when you take that same argument and you give it to a third party, and now it's being controlled by people where we the people don't have any say, it's fundamentally illegal. And so in order for that to be enforced, it requires the education of the city and the people involved, and for people to speak up for these rules that they're violating, that the state must follow. So that's kind of my high level.
Thank you for that. I'm going to play devil's advocate. Is it, hey, Vineyard, you're so dumb. The city council shouldn't have this power and authority. We're smarter than them. Deputize us as a special district, remove the voters, and we'll create a board, and we'll just do it so smart, and we can attract the Disneys and the Costcos of the world. But we don't have those Costcos or Disneys, but we're going to go through and do that. Is that and it's just trust us on this? Or, and yet years later, the inland port has failed and just tax dollars are being spent. I mean, because I'm not seeing, like, as I've gone through it, every Democrat I've ever spoken to about it that knows, every libertarian that I know, and every Republican that I know, except for if you're a part of the developer or you're a lobbyist connected to some sort of politician, because I haven't seen, I mean, and we're talking about something massive, which is the right for the people to petition their government. Like, it's like, this is not infringible, right? Unless I'm reading that wrong, it's like, why did they go to, I mean, you've gone to such great lengths to remove Salt Lake City. Why? Like, why not just go through a process of, I mean, that's why you have planning commissions and parking studies and air quality studies, is to do things right, right? So like, why are they just like, oh, our planning commission is stupid? And, you know, is there any argument to that? Like, I don't know. Okay, so there's some questions that have come in from people that I'd like to ask. And I don't know, Sean, if you want to speak up of some. Real quick, when the audit was done by the state, was that done by John Dougal, or was that a legislative audit? Do you remember, Dita?
Yeah, so it was a legislative audit. So there is another, I mean, we all could consider collectively going to John Dougal and asking for the state auditor to do an audit as well. I think the issues that you just raised, well, that everyone's raised, are right on. I mean, you've got a relatively new city, and this is a big chunk of the acreage in your city. And you all should be very carefully considering what happens with that, and planning for that, and doing it in a very public way. Like, there are lots of ideas that people have for what they want Vineyard to look like. And that should be the first conversation that happens. And then if there's some need for something, that then talk about what that is.
Then
But
they come back to us and say, hey.
yeah, but you're
what I
not
need.
there yet. I mean, have you all had the collective conversation about what you want to see happen with this property?
Well,
That
that's
needs to happen first, right?
That's my problem. We hid this onto the website. We just had an election where Sarah and I were voted in 2-1, and they didn't even post it on social media. I mean, this would be something so great and grandiose that you'd throw out and say, holy cow, we're de-annexing half of our property. We don't have the burden of having to make any decisions because there's these smart people to do it. It was like, we had to find it. And then it was like, Jeff Hartley's involved again. Okay, so why can't we just stop and look at it? I'm not a crazy person, and I don't hate Jeff. And me starting an audit in January and February and demanding it, of just saying, hey, Jeff, if you've done everything great, Mayor, and you've done everything great, the citizens deserve to know just what's going on. It's not a mean thing, especially with the islands and our loan and all that. But also now, hey, we're going to go through this and do this in 10 days. My next question is, okay, so they vote on Wednesday to explore or to do discovery or to invite them. Is that if they vote to go do that, is that like opening up the port and it's done and it's all sales final? Or how has that worked in other cities? Does anyone know?
So is it a resolution that's going to be
Yeah,
adopted?
it's like a resolution, it looks like, yeah.
Yeah, so the resolution is the first step in the process. It would be very good if that resolution did not pass, because you heard me tell the story about what happened to the Grantsville City Council, where they were like, if we adopt this, are we stuck with it? The answer was no, it could be walked back. So I think, though, maybe we want to get a lawyer to look at that to make sure that's actually true. So if you can prevent this from passing by making all the arguments that everyone's been making, that would be excellent. And, Christy named it, what's the rush? These kinds of decisions are hugely important for communities, and especially for your community. And if it's a good idea now, as she said, it will still be a good idea in 2 or 3 months or 4 months or 6 months. But there's this process of due diligence that private businesses go through when they make investments that is completely not happening in this case. And that's why you're seeing all this failure. There's no accountability. It's like if the Port Authority was a private business, they would be bankrupt by now. But they're not. They're being held aloft by taxpayer dollars. And to your question about, are they super smart? No, they're not. They're just making stuff up. You know, they come up with good economic development sound bites and throw them out, but there's no business case. And we have in our coalition experts, retired business people who are looking at all of this from the Port Authority and saying, you know, if it was a private business, it would be bankrupt. They're not, you know, this is not a sustainable thing that they're doing. This is a way to have an economic development talking point. And it's a way to help out their developer friends.
Well, and that's, so, I have a good, I mean, you guys, I gotta be honest with you, I'm a Republican, right? So the Salt Lake Tribune, when I've approached them on certain problems, even publishing, and a lot of people have seen a lot of articles from Robert and from Leah Larson, and they fact check, and they're like, hey, we're not going to put out any of this until they do. One of them that I saw early on back in September was that John Dougal did do a second audit on the Port Authority, and one of them, and I'm just pulling it up right here, was that
So Jacob, that was not Dougal. Dougal hasn't done anything. That was
okay.
all. There were two from the, sorry to interrupt you, but there were two from the Legislative Auditor General.
Okay.
One of them was this audit that Jerry Stevenson asked for, that was a partial audit. And then the other was even more narrow, and it was a whistleblower audit. So somebody contacted them and said, look at what the Port Authority is doing. They just entered into a sole source contract.
That's the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where, and that's my problem coming from a procurement standpoint, is that they started to do sole source and skip the RFP process to give work to their friends. Because again, we're talking about government money and loans and all of that, and it gets pushed over to this board. How do you know you're not giving that to your uncle or to your brother-in-law? And, you know, working with the National Institute of Government Procurement, it was like, how are you getting the goodies of the government, of loaning and taxing authority, yet you have no oversight of a planning commission or a city council? It just seems extremely, especially within 10 days. David LeRae, who is a staple within our community, is asking a question here about, you know, the developers who own the land, and within Vineyard, it's actually one property, and they'll be given taxing authority or whatnot. Now they say that they're going to continue to pay the current taxes at the present, and will pay additional taxes that are levied on top of that. And that's one special thing that we have. We have an RDA already on this property. So Vineyard taxpayers have already, together with, you know, Alpine School District and others, we took down all the properties on the Geneva Steel property to get it down to ground level. And that redevelopment agency is the city council on this particular property. And so it troubles me to think, okay, now you guys need more money than what's on top of the RDA. And so I don't know if I'm answering that question all right, but does that mean, even though they're in a special district, I mean, giving up 75% of our tax revenue for 25 years, is that the same as the Salt Lake? Is that a good deal? I mean, is that similar? How much taxes goes to Salt Lake? Do you know?
Well, yeah, when they started, they took all of it. And this is tax differential. So remember, you know, it's like the example is, say the property is worth $1 right now, and then they create the project area, and then on paper, because they've just done that, the value of the property starts to go up immediately because all the developers are circling around. So say it's like, it goes up to being worth $10. The $1 still goes to the city, but the $9 goes to the Port Authority. And then now in the agreement that you're looking at for Vineyard, 25% of that, so another 25% would go to the city, but then the Port Authority gets 75%. And what that money is used for is for tax breaks for the developers, and it's used to pay back the PID.
Okay.
Yeah, Jake, hey, real quick,
Go ahead.
just so everyone knows that on the agenda for Wednesday night is two different PIDs and this Port Authority vote. So the two PIDs come before that. They're separating the PID by west side, which would be Utah City, and east side, which would be this property. So there's several things on the agenda. And then one thing that I was going to mention, and David brought it up as well, that in this notice, it specifically says that the mayor would be able to sign the resolution immediately. She could vote yes, and the resolution be signed Wednesday night, without any further discussion, any thought. So there's a lot happening Wednesday night that, along with this port vote, but the two PIDs are ahead of it. A whole other ball of wax. They're cramming three of the most complicated things ever in the city of Vineyard into a 7-day study session and vote on Wednesday night.
So you're telling me that in a 10-day period after an election that was 2-1, a city can vote to de-annex 50% of their business property, their business, that's there, that we have cleaned up over the past 20 years with $300 million. So we that's our money already. We as Vineyard City residents have been paying for this. Within a 10-day vote, we can just de-annex this and lose out all that money on a lame duck council. And then moving forward, the new council would have no authority whatsoever over the planning of that 50% of our district.
It immediately turns it over to the UIPA for further study and everything immediately Wednesday. Good possibility there. And then to add to the PID, one of the main things I see with a lot of these PIDs, and I think this is where they're headed with especially the west side, Utah City, is the opportunity for bonus density. I don't think Utah City can get to the density they want under current zoning. So this circumvents current zoning in order to purchase in a way, whatever you want to call it, additional bonus densities. I don't know on the east side if that matters as much, but when you're looking at something on the west side, such as Utah City, and the option there to buy bonus densities, those PIDs are, it's almost like they're saying, hey, look at this port thing that we're throwing at you. Don't look at the PIDs, but there's a lot going on Wednesday.
So is the PID more dangerous than the port? In my mind, it is.
In your mind, it is or isn't? Sorry, what did you say?
It is, because you're
Yeah.
allowing taxation without representation, and you're basically, once you've got that ball rolling, I don't understand how you'd stop that. I mean, how could you ever get out of it if anything like this? Once a PID and this quasi-government entity with no one over the board, how would you shut it down? How could you? Have they ever been shut down? Oh, Christy, I'm gonna
Try to unmute Christy if you can. That's a good question, because I think at this point there's no turning back, and nothing that I can see, nothing that I've read here in these, but there's also not enough information to even know. Someone asked, just to clear this up before Christy jumps in there, someone asked about the UVU 100 acres ish. That's not included in the port area. That UVU is to remain UVU. So they've kind of carved out around the front runner station plus UVU, and everything around it will be the port area.
Okay, so the thing that I wanted to caution you guys about, and maybe, I mean, catastrophically, we found some information about eminent domain when it comes to contamination that Vineyard needs to be really careful about. And so I would check the PID contracts to make sure that there is nothing in there that would allow them to come in after the fact. And maybe Dita knows a little bit about this and say, hey, this area reaches this level of contamination. And so then they can take eminent domain. Like, I think if I recall, it opens you guys up to another, you're susceptible to eminent domain regulations regarding contamination with the PID as well. So I would look into that and caution your attorney to make sure that contract doesn't put Vineyard at risk.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but on this port, let's say they vote to approve it, the mayor signs off on it. Next day, they petition to de-annex out of the city. Then we really have absolutely zero jurisdiction over this 300 plus acres, correct?
If they annex you guys,
If they withdraw or de-annex, then we have zero jurisdiction.
yeah, I would actually have to look into it. I don't know.
Because it's no longer Vineyard City.
Yeah.
This is my problem, and correct me if I'm wrong. So tonight we're here with, Democrats and Republicans, Libertarians, and our city had a very long conversation and battle about, are we Utah City? Are we not? Are we Vineyard City? Should we do it or should we not? Tonight's conversation is completely throwing that out the window. And it's, do our citizens get a voice in the infrastructure of what would or would not happen? And so it's not Republican or Democrat, it's removing all of them and then just putting a business in, and they're going to come back and say, right, but you might be giving us 75% of the taxes, but we're so great that we're going to go make we're going to bring in the biggest big dog in the world and 500 times our tax. We can't tell you who it is, and you're not going to have any control, but there will be so much money in there that it's worth it. I guess that's the only thing. And we're going to not have a representative voice. Is that ever? So a city council moving forward, never, it would tie our hands. And we're just basically between 8th North and 1600 North on the east side. We do what we want.
Have they released a contract to you guys? Has anybody read a contract?
There is no contract. There's very limited information on any of the 3 items on the agenda for Wednesday.
Have we looked at Spanish Fork's contract to just see if maybe they have a basic one and see what some of the, starting the points are? I can check with the Spanish Fork mayor and see if I can procure that for you guys.
I have no problem, disclosing this, but they're not giving me access. I've asked for things and they said that, I'm not going to get it until I'm sworn in, which is very irregular. Obviously, usually when you're elected, they want to have in good faith and allow me and Sarah to acclimate ourselves, understand their process, invite us to meetings, get to know various people. And I'm being treated like a citizen. I have to do a grandma.
The only information, I just pulled it up to verify on the 3 topics. The only thing in the agenda packet are legal descriptions for the parcels involved and a map that shows the parcel. There's nothing at all, because there was no protest period that was waived because of all the owners, which is, a big owner.
And no citizens live in this parcel of land, and so there's no one to protest. It. They didn't have to notify any citizens of it, and there's only one owner.
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw this in the chat.
And I think that's why the legislature said, oh, well, the citizens would have a voice in this because the voters would go through and do it. But as it's written, there's no citizens that live in this parcel. So in 50% of our business district, nobody lives there yet, or would, because it's our business district, right?
So the other thing that you all should consider that I think John Benyon raised in the chat is the Spanish Fork proposal is for an inland port of a fairly large size, again, industrial warehouse development. But there's this fundamental question about how much of that warehouse industrial development Utah County needs. That hasn't been answered. So there's that. And then
Mhm.
there's also, you know, tracking along that is this issue of how this is all structured and how it takes local governments out of the equation. And I'm not sure that Spanish Fork, well, let's say Spanish Fork had more planning happening with regard to that area before the inland port came in. And so, I mean, this makes your situation more egregious because you all haven't done that yet. There's no consensus that I'm hearing about what should happen to that property. And that's the argument I think that is one of your strongest, is that you need to do that first.
Well, in the last meeting, I stood up and I asked every planning commission member, when did you hear about this? This was last Wednesday. They had heard about it 48 hours prior to that meeting. And one person refused to answer. And then we went to the city council and I wanted them to go on the record, like how long, just understanding, just to make sure that you've done your due diligence, because, you know, obviously I represent Democrats, I represent, you know, Libertarians, Republicans, all viewpoints, and something so massive of 50% of our business property. You're like, and that's what I would ask you is, okay, Wednesday we meet. What are some things that are non-deal breakers that you'd say before even any resolution is considered? What are things that you've just got to go? I mean, in my top of my head, air quality, traffic studies, obviously the impact. Obviously these trucks and all of this business would be going through Orem roads, and we need to be good neighbors in terms of Geneva Road and all of that impacting in terms of traffic study. Ethics review. I definitely see this of like, how would this, you know, is Hartley involved again? We're going to be going through an investigation, hopefully publicly, that Marty will suggest will support us and just making things public so that we're on the up and up. But also I would ask for a study of constitutional study. I would ask that a pause to get a review of the Attorney General, similar to LRS. You know, one of the best things that happened with the legislature was we went to the legislature and we said, could you just study it out and ask Forestry, Fire, and State Lands if LRS is constitutional? And I think a simple opinion from the Attorney General of saying, is this inland port constitutional? So that it is representative, so that we know. Go ahead.
Well, we sued. So that, unfortunately, so Salt Lake City went there, just where you're going, exactly what, and sued the state and the Inland Port Authority. And unfortunately, the city lost. And it was a constitutional question that was at issue, was is the Port Authority, the creation of it, usurping Salt Lake City's state constitutionally based taxing and land use authority. And in the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state. So there was one issue that didn't get fully litigated, but the city backed off. But it's worth raising the issue. I mean,
well, no, but what you're saying is that Utah inland port is constitutional. We need to separate those. Is a PID constitutional? Because they might not go the direction of the port and connect it. We already know from Ben and their executive director that he hasn't even been involved. There hasn't been very direct meetings. This isn't them coming in and picking this location, right? This is a business petitioning them saying, hey, please come here, right? And please get us out of this authority. That's a little bit different, and I can understand if it's an inland port. But those two ideas are exclusive here.
Mm-hmm.
They could just be coming and asking for a PID. And is that constitutional for them to?
Yeah.
Right?
Article 1, Section 2. Yeah, Article 1, Section 2. And then also, I think Enoch mentioned the free market. And so when you make these deals, does it violate Utah State Constitution? Also, I would look at time frame. I mean, is this, will this just be forever? And so the city, if they are going to enter into an agreement that gets rid of representation, What's the timeline on that? And then also that eminent domain and contamination would be a really big one that your city should look at. And I can get you documents on that.
Yeah. You know, whether we build a Democratic downtown business district or a Republican, in my mind, it has to be one or the two, or of the people, like by the people of like where it is. And I'm not even seeing it past the muster of like, okay, so right now, obviously me and Sarah represent one side of the equation, and we could be voted out depending on if we do what the people want. My issue is that this is locking the hands of future city council members of saying, you're not going to be involved in any, and I could think of some of the scariest things that could be put in there that I would then come back and fight, similar to Utah City. I mean, for those that are pro Utah City, obviously the citizens spoke in 2-1 and said, that's not something that we want to go through and do. But having said that, in 10, 15 years, and especially at the speed in which these ports have gone, if nothing's happened in Salt Lake, nothing's going to be happening in Vineyard for a while, right? So like times change. We're post-COVID from this. 20 years down the road, I think I should be fighting for the people's rights to determine self-determination and self-governance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to be clear again. I don't necessarily know that a port that was Utah self-sustaining that had representation on the board, and if they went about it a different way, that wouldn't be a great thing for Utah. I'm not saying that, but the way that this has gone about, and particularly you guys seem to be getting, I mean, this is the most egregious way that I've seen it go. It has run into a lot of problems. And so if you're looking at that from, since everything has not been without error previously, to assume that everything is just going to go wonderful for Vineyard, I wouldn't make that assumption. I would make sure that you guys protect yourselves.
Okay. Any other questions from the group, from any chat? Sarah and I want to beckon in a new era of education and being partners across other cities, across the county, and across the state. Vineyard has to be connected. Our roads, whether, you know, one of the biggest things that I got when I was running, when they announced Utah City, from all of the mayors calling me and saying, how was I not known? Do you know this impacts our roads? Do you know this impacts here, here, and here? How come I was cut out from your council? How come I was cut out? And I know they say that, oh, we involved them. It was like, so why are they calling us to kind of allow them at the table? And, you know, we all breathe the same air, right? And we have inversion. For the Democrats that are in the room that's very cautious for them. My wife having asthma attacks more from living here in Utah. It's something to consider, and you need to think through those things. So anything we can do on the legislative front, I mean, if this is not from the state, right? And this is not from the inland port, this is very troubling to me, because if it is, like you're saying, developer started, or Vineyard City started, we need to have a very good long public process for our city, and we probably need to design this. So anything else, like what other processes would you recommend that we need to put in place? Is there anything that you'd say, hey guys, before we do this, X, Y, Z?
Well, all the things
I mean,
that Christy named, like she gave you a long list of accountability measures that need to be in place. I mean, you all need to know what the plan is with a lot of specificity, but have your questions answered first before the deal is done. Because I'm here as somebody that has lived in Salt Lake City for 40 years to tell you that, you know, they haven't done anything for us except take.
Right. And you know, I have not aligned with our planning commission for many years in terms of density and a term of things, but a planning commission represents the elected body. And so therefore, at least it went through a public process, a public vetting thing. And obviously now the planning commission will shift with a new voice and go according to the people. But I just look at it and I go, you want to circumvent any of this? And again, we're talking with Jeff Hartley that, you know, did the loans and owner of LRS and suing Ben Abbott. I just go, man, you have a propensity of suing people. Why are we in business with this? Like, you might be a nice person, but can we answer some questions on the record? Can we talk about it? And we don't have that culture here in Vineyard yet. And I think it's reasonable. So anyone else have anything else to say?
Well, I did just want to know, I mean, can your tax base handle this? You know, inflation's up and everybody's looking at taxes. If you guys end up with something like this, is that something that your community can handle?
So I talked with Chris Judd, who was over the RDA and on the previous city council on Saturday, and he was extremely concerned. I mean, obviously we were already limited, Vineyard. We're a small city. We do not have a large tax base. I mean, so when my grandfather and our uncles and aunts, you know, founded Vineyard in 1980, it was like, we've got a prayer, but we need this much business. And they set forth this much square, and they brought in the best of minds to say, we need this much. I can't imagine understanding carving 50% out of it now and going, hey, the equation still works and we're going to carve out 75%, keep it for 25 years and still be viable. But to be honest with you, we need financial modeling, right? We don't need it coming from the developer side of thing or Jeff Hartley or anything like that. This would impact the RDA, the redevelopment agency that has put out the hundreds of millions to do that, right? And quite frankly, 10 days during Christmas for all of our citizens. I mean, I wanted our citizens to hear this because it is quite alarming. Like, this is probably the most pivotal thing that has ever impacted Vineyard. I could say that right now. Wednesday's vote, without being too dramatic, but seriously, it's 50% of our district's property, right? So I don't know. And I don't think they've done any financial modeling, or they would put it out, you know? And also, you know, showing your cards like, oh, we're going to go to Walmart, or we're going to go get a Target distribution center or something like that. It's like, okay, if you guys have the power to go and get that, why can't we know about it? And why can't that process just go through the planning commission anyway? And also, if you do need money, so you need taxation to develop it, why don't we do a public way and come to the state? There's other ways to finance, right, Dita? I mean, there's ways to go get the money. Why the convoluted removing the, there's so many different ways to clean up brownfield.
Oh, totally. And you should be looking at the array of options as a community and deciding what you want to pursue and the pace that you want to pursue it at, you know?
Right. And then that's what I'm saying, like, developers. So why, in order for you to work, why can't you go get that other financing? Is it because the brownfield is so dangerous? Okay, then let's go back to the EPA. Let's go to the environmental protection. Why is this property need to be cleaned up at such a level that you'd be required, you know?
They just took $1 billion with a B, $1 billion almost to do this cleanup since 2018.
Wow.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of money to not have completed a cleanup.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to say, for me, it's about representative government. You know, it's about, I mean, there's the saying, taxation is legal theft. And we get that, and we trade that for certain things in society. And our agreement is representative government. And for me, adding this extra layer between that and then removing your communication with that and your representation is, for me, this is where this is fundamentally flawed. You know, all the other things as well, but for me, that's the biggest issue. And so we'll write up, you know, some of the stuff, some of the questions that people can ask. And then I also want you to know that we're trying to work with legislators so that we can solve some of this on the larger end of it, the local district end, the PID end, the representation, how their boards are constructed, not just for Vineyard, just because there are other cities that are involved in this as well. So it continues.
Well, I mean, I go back to, The best of governments are slow, methodical, and listen to all voices, Democrat, Republican, and they sharpen us. They sharpen tools. I might be Republican leaning in terms of what I saw, but it's like there's a process, and to say that nobody knew that a port or a PID would be presented on Monday, and that we're going to be doing this now. Don't be afraid of Sarah and I being seated January 2nd. Like, we'll listen to it, we'll hear it. But yeah, we're going to bring in hundreds of citizens to touch it, financial experts in the city to see it. And we want to be partners. But if you're going to push this through, we're going to be investigating deeply into January as to how this happened. I don't want that to be a threat, but like, you have to die on that hill of citizens getting a voice. And that was our entire election process, was, are we going to get a voice within Utah City, and what's that government process look like? And that doesn't mean we can't get you money for cleanup, or, hey, we want businesses to come here too, and attract them and do all of those things. So anyway,
Yeah.
And I got to be honest with you, and this is a plug to everyone here. If you think Jake and Sarah are going to solve this, we're not. We need 200 to 300 citizens educated about what is a port, what is a PID, what is the RDA, the redevelopment agency. Like Sean said, oh, it's got $1 billion. That's your taxpayer dollars. And so when people come in and say, hey, where can we fight and how can we fight? And so join Vineyard Politico, because we go and we fight for documents and we fight for investigations to kind of get to the bottom of what is happening. And that doesn't mean we're accusing people of wrongdoing. We're just wanting to understand, because it is public dollars, what happened to it. Because time and time again, when it smells bad or it looks bad, you go, is this bad? And it makes them better, right? And so anyway, I'll close with that. Does anyone else have anything else to say?
Well, I just want to say, if anybody wants to write an article about this, we're happy to put this on the Utah County Republican Party site. We're taking editorials now. I will be there Wednesday, and if anybody wants to reach out, my email address is on ucrp.org. And regardless of party affiliation, we just want answers like you guys do, and we want the best thing for the Vineyard residents, and also that eminent domain and contamination thing. I think somebody posted that in the chat, and so if you want to click on that and read through that bill. The last thing I wanted to say is, I think it is 17D-4-201 is where you can read about those, about PIDs. So
Okay. I'll send everything out and post everything in Vineyard Politico, guys, and I appreciate you coming on a Monday night. We've got 48 hours if you've got ideas or thinking. And one thing that I'm really sad about, I wish our council members and mayor would understand the gravity. Citizens are not children, and if they are, it's upon us to teach them about what that government process is and teach them of their rights. Don't go quickly through it because they don't understand it. It's not a game. It's a sacred calling. Like, as I teach at the National League of Cities and the National Association, and the National Association of Counties, I go back to this time and time again. You're entrusted to listen and to study and to hear. You're not here, and you're trying to ascertain what is for everyone. And for us to say, hey, Sarah and Jake, you're not going to be involved in any of these documents or in meetings when they're discussing this, come January, it's just like, it's in bad faith. And we can't do this. Even if you wanted to go that route, you would include Sarah and I so that we would be ready for the transition. And so there's a lot of things where I'm looking at it where I go, this is dangerous, guys. And you're talking about almost everyone in Vineyard owns a $500,000 house. If not, that is that is their retirement. That affects them, right? And removing their business district could impact them dramatically on, are we viable for a police department? Are we viable for a fire department, a rec center, a light? We have none of these things, right? as a city. It's because we're so small, right? And so, anyway, anything else? Okay, I'll send out the recording. And if there, and I appreciate you guys. I know you don't come within our city, but I really appreciate you coming in. And again, we might call on you for educational purposes, just to kind of set the record straight as it did and the lake and a inland port. So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.